into a whimsical world where letters dance, revealing compelling phonics strategies that transform reading abilities. I'm Dr. Emily Sherwood. So this is part of a series of the 5 pillars of reading, the 5 essential parts of reading. And today I'm talking about phonics. Now, phonics is what a lot of people think of when they think about reading. So basically what phonics is how sounds represent letters, and the letters work together to make words, and that goes together and makes sounds, and how you put those sounds together to make words, and how to read phonetically. Now, in every alphabetic system in the world, there is a phonetic, there's some kind of phonics. Now, there are a handful of languages in the world that do not have phonetic systems. They don't have an alphabet. Notably, that's China and Japan, Chinese and Japanese. Those languages do not have an alphabet per se. And because of that, those languages are actually incredibly hard to learn how to read. It takes much longer and is much harder for a child who's learning Chinese to learn how to read than it does for, let's say, a child learning how to read in English or Spanish or French. Now, because of that, China has actually began teaching what's called pinyin, which is the phonetic system of Chinese characters. So they began teaching how the words sound using Roman letters, the letters that you would see in English, French, and Spanish. They're starting to do that at the very beginning of learning reading in an effort to help students read better. And there's some evidence that is helping. So that's very interesting fun fact. Another fun fact is that Korean used to use characters, and the Korean alphabet was actually created to be phonetically regular. So it's actually incredibly easy to learn the phonics system of Korean, of the Korean language. Very, very easy. Of course, then you have to know what the words mean, so you need to know the language. But as far as phonetically reading, it is very easy to read Korean. So, fun facts. And here in the United States, there's been a lot of controversy over the use of phonics and when and how often phonics should be used. So traditionally, phonics was used as a key part of teaching. It was just very popular up until about the 1980s for students to learn how to read phonetically, and there would be a huge emphasis on that, on explicit teaching, so teaching of letters and sounds explicitly, and not as much reading, having reading exposure, so like just reading books for fun, or memorization of words, or anything outside of this phonetic system was kind of devalued. In the 1980s, there was some research, and there was a push towards what was called whole language, and that was away from phonics. So in that case, students would mostly learn by doing. So you would read a lot of books, you would write a lot, students would largely memorize words. That's when kind of the sight word movement began. And then studies showed that we really did need phonics. So there was kind of this push-pull between whole language and phonics, and it's called the reading wars that went on mostly in the 1990s, but it's still going on today, where the question is, how much phonics should you teach versus students learning reading strategies and how to read and having a lot of exposure to text and reading authentically. Where do you do that? And the research actually shows that both skills are important. It's important to have exposure to text, to understand reading, to do things. And so is phonics, which is understanding how sounds work, and that's usually taught by explicit teaching. Well, because of some research and also a lot of media and commercial influence, we've shifted kind of too far towards phonics in some ways. So, as I said before, there's this idea that phonics is the answer to everything, that any problem a child has is having to have with decoding. And that's not necessarily true. A child can have a decoding problem, but they could have other problems instead, or also a child can have more than one problem. And so we've gone too far for phonics, according to most research. And I've worked with some of the top university scholars in the world. I've been very fortunate to have that education, and the consensus is that we need a balance. It's called balanced literacy. You have phonics, but you also have other skills, because what we're seeing now is a lot of students who have too much phonics who don't get those other skills, and so they can read, but they can read aloud very well sometimes, but they can't understand. They don't understand what they're reading. Or maybe they have trouble still reading for long periods of time, which is more a fluency problem, which I'll talk about in the future. So anyway, that's kind of where we stand with phonics. And there's a new system called Science of Reading, and if you look at it, it does include these other skills like comprehension and vocabulary. But again, because this is so politicized and there's a lot of money to be made, a lot of commercial programs that can be made with phonics because it is so systematic, again, phonics is being overvalued in some ways in education in the United States. So that's all I'm going to say about the culture of phonics and the political side of phonics. But when we talk about phonics, kind of the basics is that English has 26 letters, and each of those letters represents a sound. So for example, the letter S represents S. When you see the letter S, you can say, oh, that means S. And there's really two types of letters in English. There's vowels and there's consonants. And I'm going to talk about vowels first. So there are 5 vowels, A, E, I, O, U, and sometimes there's Y. And vowels kind of hold words together. Every word has a vowel, or it's not a word in English. And the most common is E. And this is kind of the most important in phonics, because if you understand the vowels, most of the time you can phonetically read the word, or guess the word it's really vowels that students have trouble with. So in this dance, vowels take the lead. We talk about kind of phonics being a dance. And so there's actually 2 main kinds of vowels. There's there's short vowels and there's long vowels. And if you're like me, grew up in the 80s in the United States, or if you're from another country, you may not know the difference because we didn't learn the alphabet and that was it. But now that we're teaching phonics, the short vowels are what students learn first. And when they're regular, they all make a different sound. And even within that, there's variations. For example, A usually says A, but when it's with A-N, it says A, an, like can. So there are variations even for the short vowels, but for the most part, in regular vowels, they all the short vowels make a sound, particular sound. Long vowels say their name. So for example, if we have the word mat, that's a short vowel. We have the word mate, it says A. That means a friend in English. It's a slang word for friend in some parts of the Anglo world and English-speaking world. And that says A. And with long vowels, there are 2 types of long vowels. 2 main types. There are more, but there's basically 2 main types. There's the magic, or the bossy E. You hear it called magic E, you hear it called bossy E. And with that, it's where you put an E on the end and it starts saying its name. So for example, we have the word can, like a soda can. We put an E on the end, it becomes cane, like what a person will walk with when they can't walk very well. They use a cane. Then we have vowel pairs. And in vowel pairs, the saying that they use to teach children this is when 2 vowels are walking, the first does the talking. So, for example, the word team, which is a group of people who work together. We have E and we have A. That shows that it's long. If not, it would be Tim. But because it's got E and A, the E, it sounds like an E. Now, when we're working with students, any kind of students, young students learning to read, but especially English learners, this is often really confusing because most languages do not have short and long vowels. And so students will struggle. They'll say long vowels like short vowels, and it sometimes even happens when students have been here in the United States for several years, and they may seem like they have really good English because their oral English is good. Something happens, and maybe the student's reading out loud, or the student sees something, and suddenly that student uses a short vowel. So there's actually stories of students who got in trouble because they were reading or they saw the word and they said, and the word was sheet. Like, I have a sheet of paper. Well, you can imagine the short I and what it was. It was a curse word. The same with beach. We go to the beach. Say it with a short vowel, and suddenly it seems a lot like a bad word for a woman. So there's actually been students who got in trouble, and the teacher had to advocate for those students because the students were reading it like a short vowel. So this is a very common problem with students who are learning English. Now, we also have other sounds. These are called consonants. And For consonants, there's usually not as much of a problem, and many times students can still kind of figure out the word, even if they have trouble with one or two consonants. They can kind of figure it out if they have a lot of knowledge about what the word is, if they have a very good vocabulary. But there are some cases where students read things incorrectly, or maybe they get the letters confused. And so the best example I have for that is B and P with Asian languages. In Asian languages, the B and the P are very similar. That's why if anyone is familiar with a city in the south of Korea called Busan, sometimes you see it spelled with a B for Busan, and sometimes you spell it with a P, Busan. But in Korean, there's not really a difference. You can use either. It's interchangeable. So students often have trouble with that, especially students from Asian backgrounds. There are also some letters that are not particularly found or not found often in other languages. W is not found often in Spanish. It doesn't really exist except for when you talk about words in English like Washington, because it's a place. In Spanish, the J is often silent. So you really have to think about things kind of in a cultural and a global way when working with students from other language groups, because there may be problems that seem kind of weird from an American standpoint, from a native English speaker standpoint. Many times students struggle with letters just because they aren't present in their language. We also have something that's called blends. You can also hear digraphs or consonant clusters. It's all the same thing. You can also hear the term word families. And what those are is that they're where you put two consonants together to make a sound. So for example, the word cheese. If I have the letter C, it's usually, sometimes it's a soft C, S. But then we have H, H. But we don't say H-ease or S-ease. We blend them together, and it's ch. Another word is sheep, S-H. We have sheep. You put the blends together. And these are really hard, especially for English learners, because again, they're not, in most countries don't have these. In most countries, they're not, at least don't exist. It's much simpler in most languages. And most languages are more regular if they're an if they're an alphabetic system. So that's all I have for today. I'm going to put some sites that I find really helpful in the description box to learn phonics, and I'm not paid by these people. They're just sites that I have found to be super helpful. And thank you so much. And if you're interested in literacy and global literacy and global education, please like and subscribe. Thank you, and keep learning.